Good morning. Thank you for coming and being a part of our session today. We really appreciate it. This series of lessons that we're talking about this weekend, I really think is something that can be very relevant and practical to your life because, as Aaron said last night, this is really where people are. And I think this is why lessons like what we're talking about this weekend can be so powerful because if you think about every person out there struggles with something. And we know from just research in the church that there are a lot of marriages out there that struggle as well. And so I want to talk this morning about what we can do when storms come to your marriage. The statistics are out there everywhere. For example, one survey a few years ago said that 96% of all Americans will eventually marry. Of that, 38% will divorce. Of those, 79% who get divorced will eventually remarry. And then 44% of them will wind up in divorce sometime in the future. The United States has the highest divorce rate in the world. In fact, over 50% of all the divorces in the world occur in the United States. Divorce is at epidemic levels in our nation right now. And the facts show us that divorce just does not work. In fact, if you were to go out and ask a person who has gone through a divorce and the storms that they've had to endure with that, very few would say that there were a lot of benefits to being divorced. In fact, I want to share with you this quote that came out of Newsweek magazine just a few years ago, where it says, "The landscape is littered with the victims of the divorce epidemic. Ex-wives raising their children alone, former husbands trying to start new lives and be good fathers to kids they only see on specific days, and children often torn between warring parents." What has led to what we are currently experiencing in our culture? I wonder if it could be that there are many couples out there unprepared for the storms of life that will come. Now, I want to share with you a passage today from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 25. And no doubt it's a passage that you are all familiar with. Because this passage, Jesus talks about the inevitability of storms. And he talks about the need to hear him and follow him and build on the foundation of God. Because the rains will fall, the floods will come, and the winds will blow and beat on the house. But if we'll build on the right foundation, if we'll follow God in the way that he has called, our house, our marriage house, can stand firm. That's the application that we want to use today. The key principle from this passage is that we must all work to build on the right foundation. And that means simply doing what God says. So, as we study together this morning, what we're going to do is talk about the storms that threaten our marriages. For example, there are three major things that come along that can damage us. Rains erode the roof, floods wash away the foundation, and winds can shake the structure. And the key is preparing ourselves for their inevitable arrival. And so how do we do that? How do storms manifest themselves inside a marriage? Well, I think rain could be compared to the culture. The floods could be an impending crisis, and the change could be compared to the winds that blow. And these three things will shake your marriage unless you are prepared for them. So we're going to be talking about those things today for the next few moments. I want to start by talking about preparing for the influence of culture. And the culture is all around, and it is completely bombarding us almost every moment of the day. In fact, I'm going to tell you, society is raging against the family. Everywhere you look, the pressure today against the family staying together, that pressure, the pressure to conform to the world way versus God's way is intense. And I will tell you that it's much, much more pronounced today than it was a generation ago or 2 generations ago. And we see it in 3 common ways. One, we see it with alternative lifestyles. And by that, I know the first thing we want to go to in our mind is when you see this term, you're thinking homosexuality, but That's not so much what I'm thinking about today in this lecture. I'm thinking more of how we have mass confusion over alternative roles. People don't know how to be a husband. People don't know how to be a wife. And those roles get confused. We have arguments now over gender. And then you think about the TV. How many normal families at peace, families dealing with experiencing calm and tranquility, how many of those types of families do you see on TV? And the answer is you don't see a lot. The majority, there's some kind of dysfunction in some way, and it almost seems that these alternative lifestyles are glorified. Then we see feminism. Very rampant today, especially on the college campus and in our younger generations, where the women are encouraged to lead completely separate lives from their husband. And then, of course, we have sexual freedom. Did you know that over 50% of people inside a marriage have committed adultery? Over 50%. It's amazing. And not in a good way. But that's where we are in the culture. And no wonder why. Think of how sex is portrayed in the culture. It's okay. Everybody's doing it. You deserve to be happy. If your needs aren't being fulfilled, then go out and find somebody that will meet those needs. And you can have somebody on the side, but you can still have your spouse too. I mean, there are very much those kind of ideas going on in some corners of the culture. Here's a passage from Paul, written over 2,000 years ago. And as you read verse 2 and 3 and 4, I want you to make a comparison between Greco-Roman culture of 61 or 62 AD and modern American culture of the year 2018. And one of the things that you'll see as you look at this, there's a lot of similarity. Paul could very well be describing our own culture right now. Definitely when you read these things about people being lovers of money and proud and arrogant and ungrateful and unholy and people without self-control and not loving good, I just pulled a few out of the list there. Certainly that describes the culture that we have today. And you know, when you think about the world we're living in and how it just storms against us, every one of us are facing the idea of humanism. What is humanism? In a simple to understand term, well, basically it has led to the me first mentality. And so when we apply this to the marriage, I'm coming into my marriage, I have a me first mentality. The first thing that I think about myself is I've got to do what's best for me. And how many spouses have looked at a very unhappy situation in their marriage and said, you know, this is just not working out, this is just not for me, and I deserve to be happy, and I need to do what's right for me, and so I need to exit this marriage. If you want to trace this back to the very beginning, it really goes back here to the idea of humanism. You know, instead of what is best for me, how many couples need to be asking the question, what is best for us? That's the question that we should be asking. Here's another one that affects our marriages, and it really has to do with the world system and the culture around us, and that is the idea of materialism. Materialism is everywhere. We have to have the best truck, the best car, the best house. We have to have all the toys that go along with it. We need more and more and more and more. And what happens is we get overextended. We don't have time for anything. We don't have time to nurture our marriage. We're just so busy. We never see each other. And no wonder families begin to disintegrate. Remember this. People matter, not possessions. And then we have another worldly influence on us, and that's the hedonistic culture that we live in, where this is a time of instant gratification, where it seems that moral boundaries are just collapsing everywhere. I want it now, and I want it how I can get it. It doesn't matter what I have to do. There's no more moral boundaries. I can just live as I want. So the question is how do I deal with the inevitable storms that are going to come along when the rains of culture are coming down in sheets, and it's just more and more and more? How do I handle this? Well, I think the answer is right here in Romans chapter 12. Listen, when we apply biblical knowledge, I mean, we're not talking about rocket science here. We're talking about a simple decision that has to be made on a recurring basis to make sure that I am not going to be conformed to the world. That's the decision. That's where I start. That's the foundational level of my marriage. We as a team in our marriage are not going to be conformed to the world. We're not going to let materialism rock our boat. We're not going to let hedonistic tendencies impact us. We're going to resist the me first attitude. And I tell you, there will be times where it feels like we're swimming upstream in a downstream world. We're going to have to fight against the current. It's going to take effort and intentionality to make sure that we make this happen. But we need to understand the reins of culture. We also need to be preparing for the inevitable crisis. And using the illustration of Matthew chapter 7, Jesus talks about rains and floods and winds. If you want to think about floods really, I think, could really compare easily to the crises or crises that we face. For example, here's a chart of the top 12 most stressful types of crisis you will ever face in a marriage. And as I look on this list, one of the things that I see is that in my own marriage, in over 24 years now, I have gone through several of these. The crisis will come. Be it a jail sentence, be it the death of a child, be it that you've lost your job, be it that there's some kind of major illness that comes along, whatever it may be. But the thing that we want to see here in this is that the crisis is inevitable. It will come up and engulf us. There's not going to be any warning. It's going to come on suddenly. You're going to go to bed one night, wake up the next day, and not know what hit you. It's almost like that with some of these. And when this happens, it's very easy to get overwhelmed. And look, we are not going to be the first person to ever have experienced a crisis that comes upon us. Here's David in Psalm 69. And if you've gone through a crisis already in your marriage, you know what I'm talking about. You know what David's talking about here. He says, I sink in the deep mire where there's no foothold. I've come into the deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying. My throat is parched, and my eyes grow dim with waiting on my God. Can you identify with that? I mean, it's real. When the flood comes, this is how we can feel, like we're losing touch, we're sinking, we're being overtaken by the waves, we're almost going to drown, and there's nothing that we can do. Maybe you're sitting in here right now, and that's the way you feel. And so the question is what do you do when the floodwaters come up close to your head, and it feels like you're going to drown? When you feel like you're about to be swept off your feet, what do you do? Where do you go? Well, I want to look at another passage. And this is from the Old Testament as well. This is Isaiah 43. And it is really a tremendous promise. Because here in this passage, we learn about three things that we can do. And I want to take a moment, I want to read this passage. This is Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 3. Because I want to draw some things out of this, because this passage is very, very practical for our life. And I want to look at the second half of verse 1. Fear not, for I have redeemed you, and I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned, and the flame will not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. And we'll stop there with that part of the verse. Pull out this part of the teaching, and you see three things. Three things I want to focus on here. First, when you deal with the crisis, the first step is not to fear, because God has got your back. We've got to relax in God's plan. And yes, that's hard. But we need to remember that God is alive, that God is working, and His plan is always bigger than the biggest crisis we would ever face. His plan is always more powerful than any problem you are having to experience. God's way is always more significant. And that's why He says, fear not. And then he says, I will be with you. So, in the previous passage where he said not to fear, relax in the presence of God, here we need to recognize God's presence. I will be with you. When you go through a crisis, you are never alone. Even though it may feel that you are, you're never alone. God is with you. And I want to focus on the second part of verse 2. They shall not overwhelm you. Rely on the protection of God. And here's something I never considered before when reading this passage. When you pass through the water, so guess what? You're going to get wet. God never promised that you'd be able to go through life without experiencing difficulty and trouble. And sometimes you're going to have to walk through the river. Sometimes you're going to have to walk through the fire. God doesn't say that you're not going to get wet. God doesn't say that you're never going to feel the heat. But what he does promise is that those floodwaters are not going to overwhelm you, and the fire is not going to burn you up. You're not going to drown. You're not going to get burned up because God is with you. And again, notice here, you're going to have to walk through the river or through the fire. You can't go over it. You can't go around it. Sometimes you're going to have to go through it. And I will tell you, when you go through the flood of a crisis, it is far better to go with a partner and as a team than by yourself. You need each other. And I've seen instances where a crisis comes and the couple was totally and completely unprepared for it. And unfortunately was not relying on God as they should. And over time it wound up splitting up that marriage. So it can happen. And we need to be aware of it. So again, the key here to coping through a crisis is making sure that I'm going to be firmly committed to God and my marriage. And that means I'm going to stay, even in the most miserable conditions, I'm going to make the commitment, I am not going to give up. Remember, you made a vow before God, till death do us part, for richer or poor, in sickness and in health. And on those vows went. And the key to remember is that we need to stick to the commitment we made in marriage because the floods will recede around us. So we need to be prepared for the floods of crisis. We also need to be prepared for the winds of change. And I want to put this passage up on the screen. This is from Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 1. No doubt you are familiar with it. Here, Solomon says, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. So let's make the application to our marriage with what Solomon is saying here in this passage. Solomon is saying, basically, if we make that application, when we think about our marriage, we're going to have a season. Every marriage goes through different seasons, and we might liken those to spring and summer, fall and winter. And the idea that I want to present to you is that life changes. And if you don't learn how to adopt a change inside your marriage is going to be rocked. There's going to be some extreme things that are going to happen because the winds are going to blow and it is going to make your marriage house unstable. I've had people come into my office through the years and sit down and talk about marriage issues that they were facing and then tell me, well, he is just not the same person that I married. He's changed. And you would go on through the conversation and you would learn as you listen to them that she is looking for an excuse to get out of the marriage because he's not the same person he used to be. And you know what happens in this is we always are looking at the other person and thinking, wow, they've really changed. This is different than I ever imagined. And they've really changed. And we forget the fact that we've changed too. If she's not the same person you married, neither are you. As you think about life, we're going to have to experience emotional change. We're going to go through those. We're going to deal with intellectual changes and spiritual changes and emotional changes. It's all there. Listen, I can tell you, I can assure you, I am not the same person that I was when I got married. Not even close. I don't look the same. I don't act the same. I don't do the same things. Because life has changed. My perspective has changed. And I will tell you, if you married for looks, you're setting yourself up for disappointment because beauty and looks don't last. And sometimes when we think about our life and the changes we experience, sometimes those changes are very difficult. Solomon said in Proverbs 20, verse 30, that blows that wound cleanse away evil, and strokes may clean the innermost parts. Sometimes change will be painful. But it's all for a purpose, and we've got a decision to make when change comes. Things that are unpleasant that we've been confronted with, that we're going to have to deal with, things that change brings, and we have to really sit down and examine reality. How do we deal with it? How do we respond to it? And I tell you, it comes down to two things. Will I allow this change that I'm experiencing, will I allow it to make me a better person? Or am I going to be making the decision that I'm going to get bitter about it? And really, it comes down to these two things. Will I let it make me be better, or am I going to let me become bitter? Now, what's the difference? As you look at these two words, there's only one letter that's different between the two. It's the word I. The I makes all the difference. What's the application? Well, as I think about change, as I try to cope with change, it really comes down to my attitude and how I am going to handle it. I can't make my spouse do anything, but I can make a determination on how I'm going to respond to whatever has come. We each have to individually respond to what we personally are going to do. And so the question is when change comes, how are you going to deal with it? And I want to suggest to you that there are 4 different possibilities when it comes to change. I can reject it. I can ignore the change and pretend it doesn't exist. I can withdraw and try my best to just look back to the past and say, well, that's the way I wish it was. To reject it. I can resist it. You know, I can fight the change. I can get angry. I can storm it and tell everybody how unhappy I am and fight back. Or I can resent the change and let bitterness take root. Or I can make the decision to relish that change by making the most of it. And the question is what are we going to choose? What would God choose? What would Jesus have us to choose? Well, first he would tell us, don't be bitter. And he would tell us, make the most of that change. That's what Paul would tell us, and I think I know that from looking at this passage back in the New Testament in Philippians chapter 4. No doubt you're very familiar with this passage where Paul is writing and says, in this first verse, verse 11, this is the principle of contentment. Three principles from Philippians 4:11 through 13 that really work well inside of marriage. Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I've got to learn to be content. And I know that is not the answer sometimes we want to hear. But Paul's in a very difficult situation. He could have been the most unhappy man in the world. But how he chose to deal with it was, I'm going to trust in God, and I'm going to adjust my attitude to be content with this because, really it could be worse. He was content. Not only was he content, but verse 12 shows us that he was flexible. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Paul was flexible. We're going to have to be that way. Look, if you don't have flexibility in your marriage, you're going to have trouble. Especially when changes come. We're going to be ready We're going to be ready to adjust. And then finally, especially when the change comes and it's bigger than us and we have no control over it, we're going to have to approach it with faith. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. The original language, I can endure all things through Him who strengthens me. These three principles, contentment, flexibility, and faith, all will help us navigate the winds of change. And so, as we wrap up this morning and think about what we've talked about, we have talked about the reign of culture. We've talked about hedonism and materialism and humanism and how we live in the culture of me. We've talked about the flood of crisis that can cause a couple to drift apart. We've talked about the winds of change and how change can blow you in the opposite direction away from your spouse. So the only way that we're going to cope with the culture and crisis and change is to build on the right foundation. I want to take you back here to Matthew chapter 7. These things are going to come. It is inevitable that this is going to happen. And the way that we get through it is we build on the rock, and the rock is Jesus Christ. The key is building your marriage on the right foundation. The key is placing Jesus at the very center of your relationship. And the key here is making sure that you will always do things together that bring you closer together spiritually, because that is where the real glue is in your marriage. So I want to thank you today for joining us for this session as we have talked about coping with the storms that come to our marriage. I hope you're prepared. Thank you, and let's take some questions now as we think about what we've talked about.